Hello, I'm Corey Hickson, and welcome to my Professional Ethics in Psychology capstone presentation regarding post-traumatic stress disorder therapy as an eventual outcome for my education at Walden University. Eventually, my education outcome is to become a person who is skilled in trauma and crisis counseling in order to focus on developing effective treatment and therapy for individuals who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and other pathologies related to traumatic experience. Throughout my education at Walden University so far, I discovered that violence is a social and cultural problem, and that a lot of the interventions for these kinds of cultural problems come out of transpersonal strategies for healing violent experience and trauma that individuals could be dealing with. There are several literary references for this, applying the transpersonal theoretical framework as it became more developed in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. Osrin, Smee, Srinivasan, and Weinberger do identify a lot of ways to really connect with the meaning of experience, and they do that by saying that connecting to meaning is related to realizing that experiences are valuable in larger life contexts. This is associated with peak experiences as they were elaborated by Abraham Maslow when he was developing his later work in terms of his contributions to transpersonal psychology in general. He really started developing a theory that indicated self-actualization could become greater and more community engaged through what he started calling being cognition. And he started studying being cognition by evaluating individuals who in their communities had really started to foster social change and communal healing. This kind of communal healing activity is encouraged through the perceptions that occur during peak experience due to the synchronicity of the experiences and the unlikelihood that the experiences are simply random in nature. He established that peak experience became meaningful in larger life contexts. In my experience, with the research that I had been doing so far, which is cited here on my blog, is just that I became aware that violence as a cultural problem was being called, especially in criminology circles, the result of ineffective problem solving and the unavailability of problem solving strategies that were effective for really healing dissonance, these identity conflicts between individuals and their larger social groups, or between the social groups and their larger global culture. So really, these are differences in values and social expectations and labels that can be overcome through the establishment of the meaning of identity and meaningful experience. And so my conclusion was that in a lot of cases, what's really missing is meaning. And so I later developed an idea as a part of a human motivation course that really indicated that mindfulness is in some ways just the ability to be open to experience in the context of meaning, and that really creating and attributing meaning to experiences can help encourage that transpersonal viewpoint that really puts a person in the context of the larger community and creates a motivation to begin healing the larger community in general. In a more thorough analysis of research that had to do with understanding traumatic experience and especially post-traumatic stress disorder, it became apparent that creating a context for for really establishing experiential meaning for traumatic experience was a way to begin healing from the trauma. And to be able to connect to the trauma in ways that did not involve as much avoidance or traumatic re-experience. The other part of healing trauma really became finding ways to deal with experiences that became intrusive and mitigating other stressful experiences that would tend to happen throughout the course of the day for a person who was experiencing traumatic stress. And the ability to do this is comprised of a set of coping skills, which through therapy can be practiced. And so really, in summary, the ability to move forward from traumatic experience after, of course, the initial crisis intervention and psychological first aid was the ability to discover the meaning of the experience and then to begin looking at other experiences as not really threatening in the same ways, and also to develop ways to mitigate situations that did begin to feel threatening, including memory recall and intrusive experiences that were coming from flashback memories. As a career path, really just being able to encourage this process can also help heal larger communities, because in the course of healing for individuals who are doing this establishing meaning and learning new effective coping skills, one of the ways to do that is really to demonstrate that the meaning for the experience made sense for the society and was meaningful in prosocial ways for the society, and just really being of service and being part of prosocial actions in the community really helped to become part of the larger community again, in a way to really become a part of the larger life context, as was demonstrated by transpersonal theory. In terms of addressing violence, the solution for violence in the culture of the United States, at least in the context of the USA, according to a person who at the time of the writing was a lieutenant colonel teaching at West Point, his name is Dave Grossman. He evaluated trauma gained through military experience, and he felt that really what had happened in the culture was a desensitization to violence, and that military skills and violent strategies for resolving conflict were all too available in the context of the United States culture. And so one of the things that he said was that the best way to address that was to make it so that people really understand that violence should be avoided and that we're sensitive to it again, and not dismissing it through a process of desensitization that can involve different contexts: video games, movies, media contexts, just the general tolerance and acceptance of violence within the context of the United States. The way that this applies is that as people are healing from trauma, their experiential meaning, as they apply it, and just being able to share a role in society that is prosocial and demonstrate that trauma and violence are not useful to society, or at least to the individual having dealt with it, can begin to really resensitize the larger culture and the larger community, which again brings people into the larger life context for the healing process to begin. One of the skill sets for dealing with trauma and traumatic experience in general is crisis intervention. And crisis intervention really depends on a lot of effective counseling skills that are part of other disciplines as well. Crisis intervention becomes an interdisciplinary strategy of lethality assessment and assessment of the situation, as well as very strong communication skills that can build trust and rapport, and just the ability to evaluate available coping strategies and plans of action that individuals can engage to begin recovering from crisis and trauma. through the process. Fundamental to this, of course, is the ability to be empathetic and to really create that space for the trust and the rapport building. Trust building really comes from effective, non-judgmental listening. It's very important not to attach any other attributions to experience, and to be patient and able to be present to how the individual in crisis is experiencing the trauma and any of the available coping skills that can be engaged in that process. The ability to teach the coping skills really comes from effective scholarship and being aware of different ways that people as human beings can do that, which in some ways comes through academic work, but it also comes through meaningful life experience, and really kind of understanding what it's like to be a human who is undergoing a situation that is causing duress, and to be able to realistically evaluate what works and what doesn't for people, from both a clinical and life experience perspective. Effective situational assessment, that is the ability to determine what is taking place in a crisis and what the factors that are contributing to suffering are, and the evaluation and engagement of action plans that are functional in terms of engaging coping skills and being able to mitigate crisis. These are skills that really come from clinical experience and academic training, because academia provides knowledge about what kinds of skills work in what kinds of situations, but the clinical experience is really required to be able to move forward and understand which skills, which situations, and which action plans are going to work for particular individuals from crisis to crisis in terms of crisis intervention counseling. The van der Heijden article from 2002 discusses predictor variables that can help to establish whether or not an individual will develop expertise in the field of his or her choosing. The first of those variables was the career initiative variable, which for me, I decided that it felt like career initiative, as of the writing in the article, was very closely related to intrinsic motivation, which is a process of internalizing the larger community's values that are prosocial, and in this case related to communal healing, thereby really engaging the motivation to move forward and express those values. And so for me, it was a process of internalizing values that are related to really healing and helping the community heal from violent experience and trauma that individuals in the community are going through. The second predictor variable was network participation, and this is really important to note that as a professional, clinicians are really looking for academic research and data that can be shown to indicate that the work that's being done by the professionals is really benevolent in nature. However, Miller, in the article that I have cited here, strongly indicated that people, just in the process of being part of society, are looking for relevant ways to improve human welfare, which is really the role of psychology in a lot of ways in the current culture. And in terms of my professional application of academic investigation and network participation, this is a pragmatic process that really has to be part of developing therapeutic techniques and a knowledge base for developing therapeutic techniques among mutually interested clinicians who are also in the process of helping people through the development of the knowledge and the research. So it's really important to work together, and so the network participation is somewhat implied in terms of these predictor variables. continued education and development is also implied, but it's not just implied, it's ethically required. According to the ethics of the American Psychological Association and also the American Counseling Association, competence is really important to maintain and to represent the skills that are associated with the knowledge that an individual has. So being knowledgeable in current research as a matter of scholarship is intrinsically important in being a professional, because it is ethically required. But also it is much easier to feel more effective as a clinician when the research and development are really activities that are helping to collect data that validates the current activity in terms of helping people and in terms of the human welfare improvements that I had mentioned. So really, as these predictor variables are cited, it seems pretty unlikely that expertise would not be a component of this kind of career path, given that it is academically and professionally involved as a clinician. For me to understand traumatic stress and how people are applying different therapies in traumatic stress, there were prerequisite understandings that were needed from a really wide range of psychological frameworks and concepts. The most notable were the cognitive behavioral frameworks that were really helping to create methodologies that were developing therapies that were being shown to work, and also there were psychodynamic frameworks that were sort of associated with a greater understanding of the unconscious need to identify with trauma and to integrate that as a part of the overall personality and ego. And then the original therapeutic techniques that were developed out of theoretical frameworks like this were flooding therapies and exposure therapies that were designed to break up the associations between the operant conditioning factors that were resulting in behavioral learning. So there's really three very large psychological frameworks represented. The thing was that they all began to point to the same therapeutic goals in terms of working with people who were suffering from traumatic experience and traumatic stress. The first goal that was identified was the dissolution of the cognitive or behavioral, and sometimes cognitive behavioral patterns that were contributing to how people really attribute what experience is threatening and what experience is not threatening. Because as a part of traumatic stress, people were being thought to be attributing a threat to situations that were not necessarily threatening in other contexts. So it was just the ability to sort of break up that instant association with the experience of threat. The second main point in the different theoretical frameworks was to be able to really contribute to how a person finds the meaning of their experience, and to be able to attribute the experience as something that was meaningful, and that was not something that brings up a lot of guilt or any of those kinds of consequences that are coming from having a meaningless experience or an experience that was not contributing to efficacy in the larger community. And then the third key point was people needed to develop an experiential mastery of coping skills that were going to help them deal with not just the experiences that they had, but the cognitive re-experiencing that was happening as a part of intrusive recollection and memory recall of traumatic experiences. And also these skills were needed to be applicable to the mitigation of future situations. So really these coping skills are just ways to deal with stress and to mitigate future stressors, and not really attribute them as overly threatening or harmful. In terms of the way that I'm applying the theoretical frameworks that I've been exposed to, I'm using transpersonal psychology as the larger framework. This is, as I had mentioned before, part of a journal, an academic journal known as the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, and it was founded by Abraham Maslow and Viktor Frankl. who really wanted to establish the utility of meaning and meaningful experience as it started to make a difference for people who were undergoing really traumatic times in their lives. There was a lot of transpersonal theory that was adapted specifically to assist veterans, and that's the Osrin, Smee, Srinivasan, and Weinberger article that I have cited a few times. It begins with the idea that connecting meaning with the experience is important, and it also really discusses a lot of the ways that previously developed coping skills during military service and during other times in life that may have been very challenging would also be applicable to dealing with adjusting to society and also dealing with the after effects of traumatic stress. So this transpersonal framework was adapted relatively well toward just being able to treat trauma and traumatic experience. And I should also note that this is the version of transpersonal psychology that isn't as well known in the textbooks. A lot of the work had to be revived. And cited here, I've got the Coltco Rivera article from 2006, who is a researcher that really went back to find out what Abraham Maslow was up to in terms of self-transcendence and being cognition, to see how it was applicable in the current fields of research that just because people might not necessarily be aware of the contexts that Maslow was developing later on in his work. The main research areas for understanding trauma and traumatic experience, there's really two branches to this. One of them is understanding the stress and the trauma itself, and then the other is understanding the stress and trauma in the context of ways to intervene for people who are dealing with traumatic stress in ways that are helpful. So the therapeutic techniques are one branch of the research, and then just understanding the psychological and the neurological and physiological effects that stress has are another branch of the research. Typically, people evaluate the effects of stress and traumatic stress, as well as really starting to discover the maladaptive responses to traumatic stress that people believe can result in pathologies. The Blum article is an article that really starts to demonstrate how people are thinking about what's called the neurological default network. And what the default network really is prefrontal cortex activity, connectivity associations that have been found to be divergent among people who are suffering from different kinds of pathologies, especially in mental health. And so the role of the default network in post-traumatic stress is being investigated, and so that's one of the examples of the neurological outcomes. And this is one of the articles that sees changes in the default network as resulting from early life trauma and experience. The Sherman article is a meta-analysis of psychological effects and therapies that had been developed in terms of just creating a methodology for understanding what kinds of therapy would be successful. The Chen article is a neuroimaging study designed to really understand the differences in gray matter density associated with the onset of post-traumatic stress disorder, really right after initial traumas. And then the Graham, Christian, and Kiecolt-Glaser article is one that, again, it addresses the developmental perspective of the physiological impacts of stress over longer periods of time in terms of the lifespan. So really, these are the main research areas for understanding stress and trauma. They're the psychological impacts and therapies that can be associated with that. There's the neurological component with the neuroimaging studies that are cited, and then there is also just the understanding the physiological interaction between stressors in the environment and a person's body. So moving on to the research areas in the development of therapeutic techniques. This is usually experimental research related to cognitive behavioral therapies that really have received the most attention. However, in my work, I'm really moving forward with a virtual reality technology as an exposure therapy that's really kind of helping in combination with CBT therapies to help people sort of take the intense threat part of the experience, the traumatic experience, away in terms of attribution through exposure therapy. And what people are realizing is that there's a lot of reasons to use trauma-focused therapy. And people have been thinking that maybe just sometimes applying CBT or other types of therapy that exclude the trauma-focused component could be useful, but the Rogers 1998 article that is cited there really strongly indicates that the methodologies that people were using to indicate that were not necessarily very effective. And so these days, trauma-focused therapy is what's being shown to be at least a methodological research focus for the clinical community. And that Zollner et al. Article from 2011 really talks about being an exposure, a trauma-focused exposure therapy clinician out there applying the research, and it discusses a lot of the myths and realities associated with that. In new research, in some of the new fields, dialectical behavior therapy is a kind of cognitive behavioral therapy that was adapted toward really teaching skills related to staying mindful and using distress tolerance and acceptance techniques that were being shown to, as an adaptation for trauma-focused therapy, be very useful. And that was pretty surprising for a system that was developed for the treatment of borderline personality disorder. It was developed by a person named Marsha Linehan some time ago. So really overall, there's a lot of therapeutic techniques that have been developed and shown to be effective for traumatic stress. And again, that meta-analysis article by Sherman from 1998 really demonstrates a lot of that, and it's very useful. Traumatic stress overall has really only been defined recently, and people had initially struggled with just rubricizing and operationalizing characteristics and symptoms of pathologies that are related to traumatic stress, and they wanted to be able to measure them empirically, and so it took a little while to develop rubrics for that, and that was also a cultural problem. Society hadn't really caught up with the idea that that post-traumatic stress disorder was considered a clinical pathology with related symptoms. So that may have contributed to what's cited in the Sherman article in terms of methodological concerns that PTSD and traumatic stress had only recently begun to be understood, although it's very possible that people had been dealing with this for a very long time. The research that's designed for understanding stress and trauma, as well as PTSD, is usually experimental research. The dependent and independent variables that are designed for this, they're designed to really start understanding one of the independent variables that can affect the relationship between traumatic experience, past experience, and the development of pathologies like the related post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of times, the research indicates this from a longitudinal perspective, and the reason for that is because over a period of time, it is the best way to really evaluate how people are responding to the experiences that they had, and to be able to measure the outcomes that are coming out of that experience. Neuroimaging studies are also experimental research, and what these are doing is they're measuring the changes in the neural structures in individual brains with people who are dealing with trauma and traumatic experience, and the hope with this is to really start understanding how stress and trauma change the brain, and if there's a way to really find out directly valid cognitive behavioral therapies, and to be able to predict the outcome of cognitive behavioral therapy according to neuroimaging. And what one study did find was that people who presented certain characteristics in neuroimaging studies were more successful at employing cognitive behavioral therapy techniques for the treatment of their post-traumatic stress disorder than people who didn't necessarily have those indications on the neuroimaging study, images acquired by the neuroimaging study. So really, this is part of just understanding the stress part of the branch, the stress branch of understanding stress and traumatic stress, and then research that's really designed for understanding the therapeutic interventions is also experimental research, but in this case, the independent variable is usually some kind of intervention or therapy. And the idea there is to measure the treatment outcomes and any prevailing symptoms and the eventual recovery of people who had been in the study. And the hope for these kinds of research designs is to really pinpoint which therapy is going to be the most effective for the largest number of people, and how often and how effective. Occasionally, people do develop qualitative case study research that kind of shows what the experience of being in a traumatic event is like, and what dealing with it is like, and sometimes these case studies really demonstrate some characteristics that people show while dealing with stress and trauma, and that can change in many ways the larger theoretical frameworks that host the development of new experimental research that can really test some of the ideas that are demonstrated in the broader qualitative studies that are not always necessarily as empirical or as direct as the experimental research. In terms of social change, being able to understand stress and trauma and to do crisis intervention and provide therapy for people who are experiencing crisis, this is a process that, if the information is available and the proper theoretical frameworks are applied, this can help not just heal individuals who have dealt with violence and traumatic experience, but it also can help go forward into the community and start really changing how people perceive violence and trauma, so that violence is not necessarily as well tolerated in the cultural milieu of the United States as it is today. The transpersonal dynamics that are part of that, these can really help for people, even people who have not experienced a lot of trauma, to understand their role in terms of community engagement and in terms of a self-transcendent perspective that can really help people understand a role in the larger community and in the world that helps really kind of motivate people toward that being cognition that Abraham Maslow talked about. And being cognition to Maslow was, in a very large part, just being one of the people who is strongly strongly in love with the larger community and helping the larger community to grow. So making transpersonal awareness a part of education not only really provides for a lot of meaningful experience in larger life contexts as a part of the community, but it also helps motivate people to really engage the community in prosocial ways. So moving forward with that, after my experience at the International Democratic Education Conference, one of the things that the organization that I'm helping to develop is doing is getting involved in teacher training to really kind of start demonstrating that meaningful experience and the recognition of meaningful experience especially is important for students today, because it's really that recognition piece that contributes to a lot of really successful identity formation, especially when it comes to bringing people closer to the idea that they want to be a part of the larger community and that is a part of really who they are. And so this can really not just help people mitigate the influence of the culture, but also really want to prosocially engage in their community and change the culture in a lot of ways. The meaningful experience piece of this really also helps in terms of identity formation when it comes to dealing with concepts that are available in the culture, because as people really start forming identities and finding prosocial ways to be effective, it doesn't appear as available a strategy. As an available strategy that violence really helps as much as prosocial activity does. And these are kinds of just themes that I had been picking up on in some research that I had done, which is available here. I've posted a few bits and pieces of it on the internet to really talk about how meaningful experience connects to mitigating violence and understanding our roles in the larger community as students and as professionals. Additionally, the social change that's available from this kind of career path, applying trauma-focused therapy is good, but making trauma-focused therapy accessible to people who really go through life with a sense of a warrior ethos. They don't want to be vulnerable. People do not want to be vulnerable to what are considered pathologies. It doesn't necessarily need to be indicated as a psychological dysfunction, but people are going to need a helping hand in terms of dealing with the traumas that they had been through. So if there's a way to make therapy, especially trauma-focused therapy, accessible, and make it so that it doesn't feel like it's a clinical process, it may be very helpful for the rehabilitation of veterans, which in many ways can help improve the economy and help people really seek employment again. So it's important to use the existing technology that's being developed in a way that doesn't really cause people to feel as though their psychological well-being is investigated or intervened upon. However, the exposure therapy is still available and effective. So that can create a lot of different social dynamics that will change just the clinical picture in terms of working with military veterans and military families who are dealing with combat-related stress. In addition to this, the culture can be healed through a sense of resensitization. And I had mentioned the teacher training activities, which are related to creating meaningful experience in education and for people who are developing identities, but also for people who have dealt with trauma to re-engage the community and begin really demonstrating that violence and traumatic experiences is not a useful part of life all the time, and that it really does have a wide range of consequences. So this process of resensitizing the culture through just our becoming aware of experiences that people have had because of violence and training teachers to really connect with meaning, to start mitigating that cultural influence, and also to make the therapies accessible and the training accessible, can help provide solutions to a lot of the social problems that we're seeing. And when I was at the International Democratic Education Conference, I really discovered that this was not just a solution for the United States cultural milieu, but it was also a solution for existing social problems in international contexts as well. And so that experience was very useful in terms of moving this forward. So overall, just re-engaging meaning and meaningful experience in terms of social rights and social recognition as a part of forming identity and becoming socially active as a part of the larger life context. This is something that people can do, and it becomes visible. So this helps to cultivate shared experiences that people can work together and really begin to understand their prosocial activities as a part of having a meaningful role in society. And this helps create social dynamics that really motivate people toward that transpersonal perspective, toward community engagement. And these dynamics really, the displacement creates fuel for people to really begin creating positive social change in their communities. There's a lot of works cited here. I did discuss a lot of the citations. I suppose one of the most notable is the book from Dave Grossman. And that's relevant because Dave Grossman actually brings a lot of the veteran perspective, veteranness to the research that's being done here, and then a lot of the other more technical citations that really bring the clinical perspective and therapeutic techniques that are being found to be effective into the picture as well. I cited some of my writing in here also. mostly because the social change process paper and the weblog really do kind of demonstrate how that social prototype effect, how that transpersonal aspect of really becoming socially engaged and in pro-social ways can fix a lot of the problems that we're experiencing in terms of violence in the culture. The theoretical frameworks are also mentioned here with the original Maslow article that was reprinted in a book on a humanistic approach, and then the relationship with the exposure therapy that's being developed with technology is also mentioned here, just in terms of the efficacy of the exposure therapy and just the ability to develop that technology for therapeutic use. So overall, I would like to thank you for taking the 40 or 45 minutes to review my presentation. Please do post back to me if there are any questions, and I will be available by email. Dyetan, D-Y-E-T-A-N, and that's at gmail.com. There may be some comments attached to some of the slides, so please take a moment to review those, and thanks again.